In this lesson, we will be looking at some of the theoretical approaches involved in international relations. International relations, of course, is the study of how nation-states interact with one another within an international system. As you can imagine, there is a lot of room here for differences of opinion. For example, our current president, Barack Obama, holds different ideas about international relations than did his predecessor, President George W. Bush. And of course, someone like British King George III, who ruled over the American colonies in the 18th century, would have held vastly different views than either of these two American presidents. And then there's Karl Marx. Oh boy. Yeah, we'll talk about him later. So we see there's a whole spectrum of views about international relations. In this lesson, we are going to explore the three major approaches. They are called Realism, Liberalism, and Marxism. Realism, in regard to international relations, is the approach that emphasizes the self-interest of the state within a competitive system. Don't worry, I'm going to break this down. The realism approach regards the international community as more or less competitive, meaning each state acts in its own best interest at the expense of others. This sounds reasonable, right? The United States does what is right for the United States, Canada does what is right for Canada, Great Britain does what is right for Great Britain, and so on and so forth. The states themselves are the main actors, and there is no authority above the states to regulate their behavior. The international system is considered to be anarchic, which in this sense basically means competitive. The realism approach recognizes that state-on-state antagonism is natural, and that the desire to accumulate resources is natural. Basically, in a nutshell, a foreign policy realist would tell you each state is looking out for number one. Thomas Hobbes and Niccolò Machiavelli were leading pioneers of realist theory. While there is considerable debate over this, many historians regard the Founding Fathers' foreign policy as rooted in realism. Many historians argue realism was the predominant American approach until World War I. George F. Kennan, a Cold War-era U.S. ambassador and leading political theorist, is widely considered a realist. Okay, so we often think of liberalism as a leftist political philosophy. You know, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Democrats, the opposite of conservatism. Here we're talking about a different type of liberalism. In regard to foreign affairs, liberalism is a little bit difficult to define because it is somewhat vague. But basically, it is the approach that emphasizes states establishing consistent internal political philosophies that promote peace and cooperation. Whereas realism regards the international system as innately anarchic and competitive, liberalism regards long-term cooperation and harmony as attainable. Liberalism tends to emphasize issues of ethics, morality, and benevolence. Liberalism also tends to emphasize the role of international peacekeeping organizations, like the United Nations, in regulating the actions of states. This type of liberalism is highly idealistic. Sometimes it is even called idealism. It is also closely related to Wilsonianism, the foreign policy approach put forth by American President Woodrow Wilson. Wilsonianism emphasizes interventionism, global cooperation, democracy, and capitalism. Since World War I, liberalism has been a leading international relations approach. The United Nations is rooted in liberal thinking. Again, remember, we're not talking about liberal versus conservative here in terms of political perspective. We're talking about international relations, so the term's meaning is a little different. Don't get confused by that. In order to discuss this next approach, we need to first quickly mention the man behind it. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, was a German philosopher, revolutionary, and the co-founder of modern communism. Karl Marx has been enormously influential throughout the 20th century, and his ideas have been applied to a host of disciplines, notably economics, sociology, history, and philosophy. The ideas of Marx make up what is called Marxism. Marxism is primarily an anti-capitalist economic view that emphasizes class struggle and materialism. In regards to international relations, Marxism is the approach that emphasizes the role of economics above all else. This approach rejects the paradigms of both realism and liberalism and instead insists that state actions are determined by economic factors at the expense of everything else. Under this approach, power, security, cooperation, etc. are ultimately driven by economics. Issues related to colonialism, class struggle, and materialism play a central role. Basically, in this view, it's all about the money, who has it and who doesn't. Let's review what we've learned. International relations is the study of how nation-states interact with one another within an international system. There are three major international relations approaches: realism, liberalism, and Marxism. Realism is the approach that emphasizes the self-interest of the state within the international community. Liberalism emphasizes states establishing consistent internal political philosophies that promote peace and cooperation. Liberalism is closely tied to Wilsonianism. Wilsonianism is the name for the foreign policy approach put forth by American President Woodrow Wilson. Wilsonianism emphasizes interventionism, global cooperation, democracy, and capitalism. Karl Marx was an influential German philosopher, revolutionary, and the co-founder of modern communism. In terms of international relations, Marxism is the approach that emphasizes the role of economics above all else.